sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sleepy suburban neighborhood. It was the perfect day for yard sales, the air crisp enough to carry the scent of wood smoke, but not yet biting with winter's chill. Alex shuffled down the cracked sidewalk, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. He'd already scoured half the neighborhood, hunting for old video games or comics, but so far, nothing had caught his eye. Just as he was about to turn back home, something unusual snagged his attention. Tucked at the end of a narrow driveway surrounded by piles of forgotten trinkets and yellowed paperback books was a small wooden table. Behind it sat an elderly man, his skin pale and wrinkled like aged parchment. His eyes, though, were sharp and bright, following Alex's every movement. On the table, amid the clutter of knickknacks, was a mask. It wasn't plastic like the cheap Halloween costumes he'd seen at the party store. No, this was something different, something older. The mask was made of some kind of dark, cracked leather, its surface etched with faint symbols Alex couldn't make out. Its hollow eyes stared back at him, empty but strangely expectant. "Ah, you like the mask, do you?" The old man's voice rasped like dry leaves. "Picked it up at an estate sale years ago. Quite the unique piece." Alex reached out to touch it, hesitating only for a second before his fingers brushed the cool surface. The leather felt surprisingly soft beneath his fingertips, pliable, almost warm. "How much is it?" Alex asked, suddenly intrigued by the odd, eerie quality of the mask. "For you?" The old man smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect for someone his age. "Just $1. Alex blinked. $1? It seemed absurdly cheap for something so unusual. He glanced around the yard sale, wondering if there was some kind of trick. But the rest of the items were ordinary. Old pots, rusty tools, worn-out jackets. Nothing that stood out. Yet this mask... "Sure," Alex said, fishing a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket. He handed it to the man, who took it with gnarled fingers and a grin that seemed to stretch too wide across his face. As Alex picked up the mask, he felt a strange pull, as though the mask wanted him to hold it, to take it with him. The sensation unsettled him, but he brushed it off. Halloween was just a few days away, and this would make the perfect addition to his costume. "Careful with that one," the old man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Once you put it on, well, let's just say it might be harder to take off than you think." Alex chuckled awkwardly, hoping the man was just being cryptic to sell the story. But as he walked away, the weight of the mask in his hands felt heavier, almost alive. He turned to look back at the man, but the driveway was empty now. No sign of the yard sale, no table, no piles of junk. Just an empty stretch of cracked asphalt, bathed in the fading light of the evening. A shiver ran down Alex's spine, but he shrugged it off. It was probably just a trick of the light. Or maybe the man had packed up quickly. Either way, he had his mask now. And Halloween was going to be epic this year. As he walked home, the mask seemed to pulse in his hands, its leather warming as though responding to his touch. But Alex, too busy planning out the rest of his costume, didn't notice. Not yet. Halloween night arrived with a thick, low-hanging fog that wrapped the neighborhood in an eerie, ghostly veil. Porch lights flickered on as children in costumes darted up and down the streets, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. But in his dimly lit bedroom, Alex stood in front of the mirror, staring at the mask. It looked even stranger in the soft glow of his bedside lamp. The dark leather, almost black, seemed to drink in the light, the faint symbols on its surface shifting under his gaze. He hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering just above the mask's cold surface. Just a mask, Alex whispered to himself. Just part of the costume. He slipped it over his face. The leather stretched, molding instantly to the contours of his skin. It felt alive in a way that no mask should. There was no need for a strap to hold it in place. The mask adhered perfectly, as though it had been waiting for him. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a faint hum filled the room, a low vibration that buzzed in his skull. Alex's breath caught in his throat. The air around him felt charged, electric. He blinked, trying to shake off the strange sensation, but the feeling only intensified. His reflection in the mirror shifted. The face staring back at him wasn't quite his own anymore. His brown eyes had darkened, taking on a strange, glassy sheen. His mouth, though hidden beneath the mask, twitched unnaturally, pulling into a grin he wasn't making. It was as if something inside him, something buried deep, was surfacing, pushing him aside. A cold shiver crawled up his spine, but he laughed, though the sound that came out was lower, rougher than his usual voice. He tried to tell himself it was just nerves, just the excitement of Halloween getting to him. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt had taken root. He turned away from the mirror and grabbed the rest of his costume, an old tattered cloak his mom had found in the attic. As he draped it over his shoulders, the sensation of being watched washed over him. The room seemed darker, shadows creeping along the corners, stretching toward him. Ignoring the growing discomfort, Alex opened his bedroom door and hurried downstairs. His little sister Mia was waiting for him at the front door, bouncing on her toes in her princess costume. "Finally!" she exclaimed, spinning around in her pink gown. "You're going to miss all the candy." Alex grinned, or at least he thought he did. It was hard to tell what expression was actually on his face beneath the mask. His movements felt off too, like his limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. But Mia didn't seem to notice anything strange as they stepped out into the chilly night. The moment they hit the sidewalk, Alex felt it again. That pull. The mask wasn't just fitting snugly on his face. It felt like it was drawing him somewhere, like an unseen force was guiding his steps. His senses were sharper now, the colors of the neighborhood brighter, the sounds clearer. He could hear the rustle of leaves from far down the street, the distant conversations of other trick-or-treaters. Every detail felt amplified, and it was dizzying. As they approached the first house, something odd happened. A group of kids passed by, dressed as monsters and superheroes. But when they saw Alex, they froze. One of the younger boys stepped back, his face pale. "What's with the mask?" the boy whispered, wide-eyed. Alex started to answer, but his voice, his real voice, was drowned out by something darker, something cold and unfamiliar that escaped his lips instead. "Trick or treat," he growled, the words coming out in a guttural rasp that startled even him. The boy and his friends hurried away without another word, their faces etched with fear. Mia glanced up at him, frowning. "That was weird," she said, her voice small. "Are you trying to scare them?" Alex wanted to say no, to explain that he hadn't meant to sound so menacing. But his throat felt tight, like the mask was pressing down on him, squeezing the words out of him. They moved on, house to house, collecting candy. But each time Alex spoke, his voice grew more distorted, more inhuman. The people at the door stared at him with growing unease, as if they weren't sure if he was playing a role, or if something was wrong. By the time they reached the end of the block, the pull had become unbearable. The mask was no longer just on his face. It was part of him now, changing him. And deep inside, something else was stirring. Something that was waking up. By the time Alex and Mia had circled back toward their street, the mask felt like a second skin, impossible to remove even if he wanted to. And he did want to. With every step, the weight of it pressed harder against his face, its presence more suffocating, more alien. The pull that had guided him earlier was stronger now, tugging at him from somewhere deep within the neighborhood. But the direction wasn't clear. "Are you okay?" Mia asked, her voice tiny beside him. She had noticed the way he had grown quieter, more distant. He was barely responding to her anymore. "I'm fine," Alex rasped, though the words that came out sounded off, deeper, not his own. The mask had altered his voice again, twisting it into something that barely resembled what he recognized as himself. Mia flinched at the sound, and Alex's heart twisted in guilt. But beyond the guilt was something worse, a cold, creeping fear that maybe the mask was doing more than just changing his voice. As they approached their house, Alex reached up to pull the mask off. He grabbed at the edges, trying to peel it away from his skin, but the leather had somehow fused to his face, as though it had become part of him. Panic flared in his chest. He clawed at it, his fingers digging into the material, but the mask wouldn't budge. It clung to him, tight and unyielding. "Alex?" Mia's voice was nervous now, her wide eyes watching him. "What's wrong?" I can't get it off," Alex stammered, his breathing growing shallow as the edges of the mask bit into his skin, almost as if they were alive, tightening their grip. His pulse pounded in his ears, but beyond that, there was something else. Whispers. They came from deep inside his mind, faint but insistent, murmuring in a language he didn't understand. He stumbled backward, away from the porch light's warm glow, and into the shadows of the front yard. The whispers grew louder as he moved, as if they were guiding him. For a fleeting moment, Alex had the horrifying thought that the mask didn't want to come off. He glanced at Mia, her face now pale with concern. "Go inside," he muttered, though the words came out as more of a growl. "Just go, okay? But now..." His voice was louder than he intended, and it startled her. She took a step back, then turned and bolted up the porch steps, slamming the front door behind her. Alone in the dark, Alex's hands trembled as he yanked at the mask again, his fingers growing desperate. But the mask felt as though it had merged with his skin, and every tug sent a sharp jolt of pain through his head. The whispers continued, weaving through his thoughts, growing more coherent, more threatening. "Help me!" Alex shouted, but no one was around to hear. The quiet street was empty now, the last of the trick-or-treaters having vanished into their homes. And then, through the fog of fear, a memory surfaced. Something the old man at the yard sale had said, right before Alex had walked away. "Once you put it on, it might be harder to take off than you think." A cold sweat broke out across Alex's forehead. Harder to take off. What had the man meant by that? The mask wasn't just a piece of a costume. It was something else. Something ancient. Something wrong. Desperate for answers, Alex bolted down the street, his feet pounding the pavement as he ran toward the house where the yard sale had been. The mask tightened around his face with each step, the whispers swelling louder, urging him to keep moving, to go faster. He stumbled through the fog, barely able to see, his vision blurring as the mask seemed to press into his eyes. Finally, he reached the spot. But the house, just as it had been earlier, was empty. There was no sign of the old man, no sign of the yard sale. The driveway was bare, as though nothing had ever been there in the first place. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood in the empty street, turning in circles, searching for some clue, something to explain what was happening to him. Then, as if in answer, a soft wind stirred the leaves at his feet, From somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper drifted on the air. But this time, it wasn't coming from inside his head. It was outside, in the world around him. The same words, the same tone, low, dark, and ancient. Alex followed the sound, his heart pounding harder now. His body felt numb, like it was moving on its own, driven by a force he couldn't control. As he stumbled deeper into the fog-shrouded neighborhood, the mask's whispers finally became clear. They weren't guiding him to safety. They were guiding him towards something much worse. The mask wasn't just changing his voice, his face, or his thoughts. It was replacing him. Alex's steps slowed as the fog thickened around him, swallowing the familiar shapes of the houses and streetlights. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. The mask's pull was relentless, guiding him deeper into the heart of the neighborhood, into the shadows where the streets seemed to blur and twist. His thoughts felt heavy, slipping away like water through his fingers. The voice inside his head, the one that had always been his, was fading. And in its place, something darker, more insistent was growing. He tried to focus, tried to remember who he was, but each time he grasped at a thought, the mask tugged him further away. He could feel it now, inside him, not just on his skin, but in his mind. Its presence was like a second consciousness, weaving its way through his brain, whispering, laughing. Every step he took felt less like his own. Suddenly, his feet stopped, and Alex found himself standing in front of an old, run-down house. The windows were dark, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. It was the kind of house that looked abandoned, but something about it felt alive. He didn't remember walking here. He didn't even know how far he had traveled. His legs felt foreign, as if they were no longer responding to his will. The mask's pull had led him here. It had brought him to this place for a reason. For a moment, Alex fought the urge to move forward. His body trembled with the effort, his muscles twitching, resisting the unseen force. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus. I have to get control. I have to... But the mask was stronger. It wanted him to go inside. It needed him to. Without thinking, his hand reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold, sending a shiver up his arm, but the door swung open easily, creaking on rusted hinges. The darkness inside beckoned to him, and before he could stop himself, he stepped over the threshold. The air in the house was thick with the smell of dust, and something older, something rotten. The shadows were heavy, pressing against his vision, but the mask guided him. His feet moved with certainty now, each step echoing through the silent halls. As he walked, Alex felt a strange sensation creeping over him, a sense of detachment. His hands no longer felt like his own. They hung limply at his sides, swinging with a dull, mechanical rhythm. His heart beat in his chest, but the rhythm was slower, more deliberate, as if something else had taken control of his pulse. A mirror hung on the far wall, dusty and cracked, but the reflection that greeted him wasn't his anymore. The face behind the mask had changed. The eyes that stared back at him were no longer his familiar brown. They were black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light. His skin, once tan and freckled, was pale, almost gray, and his lips, though hidden by the mask, had stretched into a grin he didn't feel. It was as though the mask had become his true face, and the person he had been before was slipping further away, like a distant memory. Panic gripped him again, but it was weaker this time, muffled beneath the mask's influence. He tried to pull away from the mirror, to rip the mask off once more, but his body refused to obey. The mask's whispers flooded his mind, soothing, promising. Soon. Alex's breath hitched as he realized what was happening. He wasn't just wearing the mask anymore. He was becoming it. The room around him began to warp, the walls twisting, the ceiling pressing down, the floor shifting beneath his feet. But it wasn't the house that was changing. It was his mind. Reality was slipping, bending around him, reshaping itself into something unfamiliar, something monstrous. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and Alex's eyes were drawn to the corner where a figure stood. Cloaked in shadow, its outline was vague, shifting with the darkness. But Alex knew, felt, that this was the thing behind the mask, the thing he was becoming. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and as it did, Alex felt an overwhelming urge to walk toward it, to merge with it. No! Alex's voice was a strangled whisper, the only part of him that still felt real. He stumbled backward, but his legs moved sluggishly, as if the air had thickened around him, holding him in place. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as though considering him. Then, in a voice that echoed through the depths of his mind, it spoke. "You're almost ready." The words were cold, final. Alex's skin prickled, his heartbeat hammering against his chest. He didn't know what the figure meant, but he knew it wasn't good. Whatever the mask had planned, it was nearly complete, and when it finished, there wouldn't be anything left of him. His vision blurred again, the room spinning. He had to fight it, had to find a way out, but the mask's grip on him was tightening. The whispers were louder now, drowning out his thoughts, commanding him to obey, to surrender. And then, just before the darkness consumed him entirely, a thought pierced through the fog. Midnight. The mask had to be off before midnight, or he would be lost forever. But as the clock ticked toward that fateful hour, Alex couldn't tell whether he still had the strength, or the time, to save himself. The cold night air hit Alex's face as he stumbled out of the house and into the fog-drenched street. His body was shaking, drenched in a cold sweat, and the mask felt tighter than ever, as though it had sunk deeper into his skin. His thoughts were tangled, half his own, half something else's. The figure in the house still lingered in his mind, its dark, shifting outline burned into his memory. Midnight. That was all that mattered now. Alex glanced around, but the familiar neighborhood was almost unrecognizable under the heavy fog. The streetlights were dim, their glow barely cutting through the mist, and every shadow seemed to flicker with unnatural movement. A distant clock tower somewhere in town chimed, its hollow sound ringing out into the night. 11 o'clock. He had 1 hour left. Alex broke into a run, his heart pounding in his chest, though he wasn't sure where he was going. His mind raced, trying to grasp at any thread of information. He needed answers, how to break the mask's hold, how to stop this transformation. But with each passing minute, his thoughts grew cloudier, the mask's voice stronger. Memory flickered at the edges of his mind. The old man at the yard sale. He knew. He had warned Alex. The man had known what the mask could do. He had to know how to stop it. But how could Alex find him again? He had already tried returning to the house, but the man was gone. No trace of the yard sale remained. And yet, the old man's words echoed in his mind, clearer now than before. Once you put it on, well, let's just say it might be harder to take off than you think. There had been something in his voice, something more than just a warning. A clue, hidden beneath those cryptic words. Desperation clawed at Alex as he tried to think, to make sense of it. His mind was splitting. Half of him was still Alex. The other half, the part the mask was taking over, was darker, colder, less human. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping cold that wrapped around his thoughts and squeezed. And then it clicked. The mask didn't want to come off, but that didn't mean it couldn't. He had to force it, break its hold before it consumed him entirely. But how? Where would he find the strength to fight something so ancient, so powerful? The distant sound of laughter interrupted his thoughts. Alex turned toward it, his pulse quickening. A group of kids dressed in bright costumes was heading down the street, their candy bags swinging as they walked from house to house. They hadn't seen him yet, hadn't noticed the twisted mask clinging to his face, or the way his shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally in the mist. Something inside him, the part of him that was no longer fully Alex, wanted to move toward them, to watch, to see their fear. But he shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The clock was ticking. Desperately, Alex turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement as he headed deeper into the neighborhood. He had no clear plan, only the overwhelming need to get away from the kids, away from the temptation. The mask's pull was stronger now, urging him to give in, to let it take control. In the distance, he saw the faint glow of a church steeple rising above the fog. The old church had always been there, at the far edge of town, its worn stone walls and tall windows casting long shadows. Suddenly, it felt like his only hope. The church had been a place of safety for as long as he could remember, a place where his family had gone on rare Sundays, where the air always felt calm, untouched by the outside world. Maybe, just maybe, he could find some kind of sanctuary there. Breathless, Alex reached the churchyard and threw open the iron gate. It creaked loudly, echoing through the stillness. He sprinted toward the door, his legs aching, every breath burning in his lungs. The whispers in his head screamed at him now, louder than ever, but he forced himself to move, to push forward. The door to the church was unlocked. Alex shoved it open and stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. The interior was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering candles near the altar. The heavy silence pressed down on him, the air thick with the smell of incense and old wood. Alex's heart raced as he looked around. The church felt empty, abandoned, but he didn't have time to worry about that. He could feel the mask tightening again, as if it knew the end was near. There had to be a way. Something in here. Some symbol of protection. Some force that could stop the mask's curse. His eyes scanned the walls, the stained glass windows, the old pews. And then he saw it. An ancient wooden cross, hanging just above the altar, its surface cracked and worn from years of exposure. It was the only thing in the church that looked as old as the mask itself, as if it had been there for centuries. Alex's hands shook as he reached for it. The whispers in his head screamed louder, the mask fighting back, but he gripped the cross with all his strength and held it to his chest. For a moment, everything was still. The mask seemed to tremble, as if it had met its match. The clock was still ticking, and midnight was almost here. The heavy silence of the church pressed in on Alex as he clutched the ancient wooden cross to his chest. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a reminder of how little time he had left. The whispers inside his head, those low, guttural voices from the mask, had faded, replaced by an ominous stillness. He could feel it now, the mask tightening with each passing second, as though it sensed the approaching midnight hour and knew that its final transformation was almost complete. But there was still something left of Alex inside, something fighting to break free. He dragged himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, and turned to face the altar. The church's dim candlelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, cross in his hands felt heavy, its ancient wood rough beneath his fingers. It was his only weapon, the only thing standing between him and the mask's full control. But would it be enough? The clock in the distance began to chime. 12 slow, echoing tolls rang out, each one vibrating through the cold stone walls of the church. Midnight. The sound reverberated in Alex's skull, a terrible reminder that time had run out. With a sudden jolt, the mask came alive. It wasn't subtle anymore. It clamped down on his face, the leather digging into his skin, sending sharp stabs of pain through his temples. Alex gasped, stumbling backward, his hands flying to his face as he tried to pry the mask off. But it was too late. It was no longer something he could simply take off. The mask had fused to him completely, its dark magic sinking deep into his flesh. And then came the laughter. Low, sinister, and cold, a sound echoed through the empty church. It wasn't coming from the mask. It was coming from somewhere inside Alex's mind, a voice that was no longer just a whisper but a presence. Something old, something malevolent. The mask wasn't just transforming him physically. It was replacing him, erasing him piece by piece. "You're mine now," the voice rasped, filling his head like a swarm of gnawing insects. Alex felt a wave of panic rise inside him, but he forced it down, gripping the cross tighter. He wouldn't let it win. He staggered toward the altar, barely able to see through the haze clouding his vision. The mask made his limbs feel heavy, sluggish, like he was fighting against an invisible current. His reflection flashed in one of the church's stained glass windows, and what he saw stopped him cold. The person staring back at him wasn't Alex anymore. The eyes were black, endless voids, gleaming with a cruel intelligence. His skin had grown pale, almost ashen, and his body had taken on a hunched, unnatural posture. He wasn't human anymore, at least not entirely. The mask had done its work. He could feel it now, the other presence inside him, pushing at the edges of his mind, trying to claim what was left. But Alex wasn't done fighting. With a cry of desperation, he raised the wooden cross high above his head and slammed it down onto the stone floor. The crack echoed through the church, loud and sharp. For a moment, the mask seemed to hesitate, as if the sound had startled it. Alex could feel the presence falter, just for a second, its grip on him loosening. He slammed the cross down again, harder this time. A flash of light burst from the point of impact, flooding the room with a blinding brilliance. The mask screeched in his mind, its voice rising in a furious howl. Alex could feel the pain now, intense, searing. But he didn't stop. He brought the cross down a third time, putting every last ounce of strength he had into the motion. The light grew brighter, so bright he had to close his eyes. And then, with one final shudder, the mask broke. Alex collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his chest heaving. The mask had shattered, its pieces scattering across the stone, dissolving into nothing but a thin, dark mist. The presence inside him, the one that had been so strong, so close to taking over, was gone. Silence. The church was still, the only sound the distant flicker of candlelight. Alex's hands shook as he reached up to touch his face. His skin felt raw and sore, but it was his face. The mask was gone, and with it, the terrible weight that had been pressing down on his mind. Slowly, painfully, Alex stood up. His legs were weak, his body trembling from the effort, but he was free. He had won. But as he turned to leave the church, the faintest whisper drifted through the air. "Until next Halloween." Alex froze, his blood turning to ice. The whisper was so quiet, so subtle that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mask wasn't destroyed. Not entirely. It had merely returned to the shadows, waiting for the next unlucky soul to find it. And when they did, it would be ready to play its final trick again.